Well, thank you, Comrade President Swan. It is an absolute pleasure to move Chapter 4 and to have the chapter seconded by my good friend and colleague Tony Burke, who has such a wonderful record in this portfolio area over many, many years. Before I move to the chapter, I want to acknowledge that, like all of the chapters in the platform, this is the product of an extraordinary amount of work over recent months by party members, by staff members of the FPLP, by FPLP colleagues, by the trade union movement, particularly in the really difficult area of energy. A number of trade unions in the ACTU have worked particularly hard on the just transition policy with my colleague Pat Conroy, but I particularly want to mention, at the risk of singling them out, the Mining and Energy Division, who are particularly at the pointy end of this and have devoted extraordinary resources, along with the ASU, the ETU, the Metalworkers Union and many others on this policy area. And finally, but not least, I want to pay tribute to the Lime Green Army up the back there. This is an extraordinary grassroots movement within the party. Hundreds of sub-branches and FECs before the 2015 National Conference received a briefing from Lean about our 50% renewable energy target, adopted its policy at the last conference, and the importance of just transition and a good emissions reduction target at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. And they've backed that effort up, an effort that was rightly rewarded by National Conference in 2015 with their campaign about environment laws, which Tony Burke will be talking about as well. So this is a great grassroots movement within the Labor Party, and I want to congratulate all of the members of Lean across the country for their commitment and their understanding about how you deliver real change within a real progressive party like Labor that's committed to getting real outcomes in Australia. Over the last several hours, the 24th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Climate Change Convention has wrapped up in Poland. And like all of them, it's been a very difficult conference to get agreement across 194 different nations about this incredibly complex, multi-layered challenge that we all face. But at the beginning of the conference, perhaps the world's most famous naturalist, David Attenborough, described climate change as he was trying to urge the nation-states of the world to be ambitious and to be bold in this area. He described climate change as a man-made disaster on a global scale, as the greatest threat that humanity has faced in thousands of years. And this warning, this call to arms from this extraordinary individual who's devoted so many decades to educating people across the world about the importance of our natural environment, followed on from a deeply confronting report by the world's climate scientists in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they laid out in the starkest of terms the impact of just 1.5 degrees of global warming or 2 degrees of global warming. And it makes for very difficult reading, because even 2 degrees of global warming, which I think we've too often assumed would be a safe level of climate change, even 2 degrees of global warming will destroy more than 99% of the world's coral reefs, including that natural wonder of the world for which we have stewardship, the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland. An El Niño is building in the Pacific as we speak, and it runs the risk of subjecting the Great Barrier Reef to the third major bleaching event in just 4 years. The third major bleaching event in just 4 years. In all of recorded history before that 4-year period, there's only ever been one major bleaching event before on the Great Barrier Reef. An extraordinary environmental asset, but one that also sustains, in a direct sense, more than 60,000 jobs on the Queensland coast and generates billions and billions of dollars in economic activity for the nation, but particularly for the Queensland tourism industry. These reports aren't new, and it's not just the impact on coral reefs and agricultural production and coastal communities with accelerating sea level rise. The World Bank said a couple of years ago that 2 degrees of warming is likely to cut global cereal production by 20%. And in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, where we know we're going to see almost all of the net increase in population over coming decades, that cut to global cereal production will be as much as 50%. This is an extraordinary challenge to the survival of human society as we understand it. And that's just 2 degrees of warming. The tragedy of where we are now, even at the end of the Poland Climate Conference, is that we're not tracking anywhere close to keeping global warming to 2 degrees. We're tracking much closer to 3 or 4 degrees of warming. Humanity is now facing a climate emergency, one that will unfold over decades, but is already having impacts on our society and our natural environment now. Barack Obama famously said, "Ours is the first generation to feel the impacts of climate change and the last generation with a serious ability to do something about it." And here in Australia, we are not doing enough about it because of the government that we have. At the Paris Climate Conference, the new climate change minister, described by her own colleagues as an L-plate minister, presided over another series of embarrassments for Australia. Sort of embarrassments we've seen in 5 successive conferences under Abbott, Turnbull and now Morrison. Australia lined up with the Trump administration, Vladimir Putin, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to refuse to give the ordinary recognition, the usual recognition to that IPCC report, the report of the global scientific community. We ranked 55th out of 60 nations in the Climate Change Performance Index, actually ranking below Putin's Russia on climate change policy and performance. And yet again, this government turned its back on communities that will be impacted by climate change and climate change policy by refusing to sign the Silesia Declaration that reinforces the importance of just transition, a key clause in the Paris Climate Conference agreement that the Turnbull government lobbied to have excluded. We've seen a much more structural abdication of responsibility from this government. Since this government was elected and they tore down every single piece of the Gillard government's proud climate change policy framework, carbon pollution, unsurprisingly, has started to go up. It's gone up every year and it's projected to go up every year all the way to 2030. We are now the only major advanced economy in the world where carbon pollution and greenhouse gases are going up rather than coming down. Over the course of the last 3 or 2.5 years since the election, this government has had 11 energy policies. Count them, 11 energy policies in 2.5 years. My colleague Pat Conroy counted under Malcolm Turnbull's last desperate gasp as Prime Minister, 4 energy policies in 14 days. 4 energy policies in 14 days. And beyond energy, there's nothing in transport. There's nothing in the land sector. There's nothing in the industrial and mining sector to start to cap carbon pollution levels and bring them down. And as we all know, after 5 years of bitter experience, that's because, as Malcolm Turnbull said, the coalition is simply incapable of coming to grips with climate change. Well, Labor's not just willing to start to deal with this challenge, we are impatient for it. We are impatient to put in place our stable, ambitious policies of 50% renewables, of coming to grips with pollution in the transport sector, the industrial sector and the land sector, because we intrinsically understand the responsibilities that this conference and every conference back to 1900 has recognised that the Labor Party has to our children, to our grandchildren and their children beyond. This chapter, delegates, sets out Labor's plans on climate change and energy, and as my colleague Tony will outline, in the broader natural environment space, and I have great pleasure in commending the chapter to you and moving it formally. Thank you very much.